All right, we are now live, and I'm up here in the bedroom. You can see the bookshelves behind me. Let me adjust the lighting a little bit. The YouTube, one of the features I'd love if YouTube would actually bring back is they're adjusting lighting and stuff like that. And if they could adjust sound, that would be really amazing. Uh, you know, this feature seems to be working properly for once, which is good. We already have a lot of people here and a lot of questions lined up. I'll just say this: I wanted to do a stream that would be sort of a um, end to the decade. I know some people are sticklers. Oh no, the decade doesn't end until some other point. But as far as everybody else is concerned, this is the end of the 2010s. And for me, as I pointed out in the video that I did just yesterday, that has been, in large part, a decade for me to be on YouTube, and a decade of moves. Moved first up to New York to be with Andy Shaka, my wife, um, from Fayetteville, North Carolina, and then we moved from Kingston, New York, back here to Milwaukee, where we currently live, and I imagine we will probably stay as home base the rest of our life. I mean, we do want to travel eventually once we're no longer quite so busy and our finances are in great shape, which is something we're going to try to do this decade. But for now, we're really happy to be here. So I see that one person asked about New Year's resolutions, and another person said no New Year's resolutions. I haven't actually like formalized New Year's resolutions at this point. What I did was when I hit my 18 my uh, August 18, that's why I'm saying 18th. When I hit my 49th birthday back in August, I came up with a list of things that I wanted to be in better condition or better shape by the time that I hit 50. So, things I was going to work on. One is, getting to the gym regularly. This 7-class semester really took a toll on that because I was spending so much time either doing class prep or grading or going to or from classes or dealing with student issues or actually teaching. There were all sorts of technology problems with the prison class that I was teaching that sucked up a lot of time and energy. So my goal is to get to the gym 5 days a week in this coming year, and I'm figuring, I'm by the way, I'm not looking for advice about what sort of workouts to do. I've got that quite covered. I like my weight circuit, which I'll be doing 3 days a week. My cardio circuit, which I'll be doing 2 days a week. I've got a elliptical downstairs in our little gym for our apartment complex. I can always use if I want to. I'm going to start walking a lot more around here just for pleasure. Part of that was just not having enough time. So, there's all of that coming up. Obviously, I want to get a lot more reading time in. That's quite important for me. Get some more academic writing done and get some book projects actually, if not published, underway at least. And as always, work on my relationship with my wife, Andy, and with other people involved in my life, like my kids, who are kind of a moving target since they're adolescents. So I don't actually have any like actionable New Year's resolutions at this point. And I'd be interested to see other people in the chat, if you want to put what your New Year's resolutions are. I think that would be kind of cool. So let me. There's already a lot of questions here. Let me address those. Daniel Williams asks about a Daniel Russell book called Practical Intelligence and the Virtues. I've never read it, so I can't really say much about it. But then he asked, do you think Aristotle's idea of phronesis or practical intelligence is relevant in our times? And I would say, yeah, but um, I'm coming more and more to see that much in Aristotle that's important is really underdetermined, and Aristotle will often make rather sweeping statements that have to be qualified from an Aristotelian perspective. And I think too many Aristotelians take some of the statements that he makes at their, at his word, and then try to cobble together a system out of it. And I don't think that's very Aristotelian, actually. So, I've always been a big admirer of Alasdair MacIntyre and other neo-Aristotelians doing similar work, where they say, well, we have to adapt Aristotle, we have to rethink Aristotle along those lines, and taking into account what other traditions, for example, the Stoic tradition. A. Long has a great argument in one of his pieces about this, that the Stoic tradition is actually a MacIntyrean tradition constituted rationality. It has to take into account what its rivals would have to say. So, yeah, phronesis is absolutely important. How we conceptualize it, I don't think Aristotle provides us with sufficient resources for the conceptualization of it in the text that we have. So we need to go to look at later Aristotelians, the commentator tradition, and by that I don't mean jumping straight ahead to Thomas Aquinas. I mean reading Alexander of Aphrodisias, and I mean also looking at what other not specifically Aristotelian, but certainly taking Aristotle into account thinkers like Cicero or Plutarch would have to say about it as well. So, Jacob, Donato, metaphilosophy, Wittgenstein, philosophy is one, and all extension is only humanities, personalities. And the answer of explanation is as simple as it's been: adult behaving badly. I don't know what any of that means, but it sounds kind of interesting, so I'll take you at your word. Camille asks, maybe it's time to summarize philosophy in the 21st century. Where is it going? I don't know. That's a good question. If we're talking about academic philosophy, and that extends not just to who's teaching, but also like who's publishing in traditional philosophy journals and presses, like Oxford, University Press, or Stanford University Press, or things like that. I think philosophy is, at this point, so fragmented that any attempt to try to provide some sort of definition that would corral everybody in is doomed to failure, or to stifling, philosophical work and innovation. I don't know where philosophy's headed. I guess you could say that doing philosophy in popular ways is going to be massively important. One thing I would say is that if we look at the history of not just philosophy, but the history of ideas generally, one thing that we can say for certain is that whatever people were taking to be the most important thinkers and ideas of their time, they're usually wrong. And the formats in which people think philosophy, or whatever counts as philosophy, has to be done in their time, are usually passed up and played around with, and you don't have to be a postmodernist to buy into that. I think you just have to actually look at history and approach it in a non-schematic way. So I don't know where things are going. Calypso, going to be finishing my first read of Plato's Gorgias tonight. Might follow it up with starting Aristotle's Rhetoric on New Year's Day. Well, that's good. The Gorgias is quite important for, you might say, setting the stage and allowing yourself a contrast between Plato's rather dismal conception of rhetoric. I mean, there is that possibility of good rhetoric in the Phaedrus, and then Aristotle's much more pragmatic conception of the importance of rhetoric as being something related to dialectic and necessary in ethics and teaching and politics and all these other areas, and having connections with literary composition in the poetics. So that's a good thing to do. R.T. Whitby, what did Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle think about the relationship between knowledge and virtue? They thought knowledge was important for virtue. Socrates and Plato appear to have thought that the virtues are types of knowledge. Aristotle thinks that they are as well to some degree, but Aristotle differentiates between a lot of different types of knowledge. Just read Nicomachean Ethics book 6, and you'll see that. So, there's some connection between the two. Obviously, simply knowing things isn't enough for actually having virtue or doing things. Andrew says, "Hi, Greg. Thanks for doing this. You're very welcome. Earlier, I was listening to a podcast that attacked Stoicism as pessimistic in nature. What would be a good defense against this?" Telling them to actually read the texts. Stoicism, the gloss on Stoicism is that it's pessimistic in nature. Simply reading Stoic thinkers would disabuse one of that very quickly. And people who don't actually read the texts, I'm not sure what you can do with them other than telling them, hey, the actual writings say something that contradicts your mistaken view on things. So, that's kind of a hard one. Factotum, you got a question here on Blind Guardian, who I haven't listened to for years, so I can't really say much about it. Blind Guardian and their song about the Iliad and the album about Tolkien's Nightfall in Middle Earth. I don't really know those. I don't really listen to a lot of post '90s metal. They are a good, as far as I remember, right, a good power metal band. But I mean, I'm still rediscovering stuff that was done in the '70s and '80s and sometimes early '90s that's fairly mind-blowing. And so I don't really have much expertise when it comes to the later power metal bands. The later any genre metal bands. I don't have that much to say even about doom metal. Aaron asks, any thoughts on Dr. Peterson's work? I've talked about that many times. I don't hold it in any high respect. I think that his first book is just kind of gobbledygook, mishmash of all sorts of things with a lot of diagrams thrown in. I don't think that he ever made his reputation on the basis of that book, Maps of Meaning. I think it was the videos that people had of him. And, I like some of the same thinkers that he does, like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Solzhenitsyn, but I certainly don't come to the same conclusions that he does. And I think that he's a careless scholar. His view on what postmodernism is clearly inadequate and highly polemical. He showed up to his discussion with Zizek without having done basic research into what communism would be, other than reading the Communist Manifesto. So, he's the kind of person who, if he was a peer, I probably, like many of his own peers in his university, would kind of ignore him. I guess he appeals to a lot of young men, but it's sort of like a diet. Any diet you go on, you're probably going to lose some weight at the start. So, if you use his rules for life, you're bound to fix some things in your life. But why not go with something better? Why go with something that's got so many ideological commitments, unless it's really that you love those ideological commitments, like you're an anti-feminist, or you think that it really is a matter of order versus chaos. But then, shit, why not just read like Roger Zelazny or Michael Moorcock or some of the great fantasy writers who are talking about that? Why buy into this guy's stuff? So. R.T. Whitby, did Plato think some types of knowledge are more valuable than others? Depends on what you call knowledge. So if you look at the divided line in Republic Book 6, and then you follow it up with the Allegory of the Cave in Book 7, there are some things that are clearly knowledge. They're knowledge in a broad sense, and they have to do with the forms, but it's the way in which the forms are apprehended. Are they apprehended by way of abstracting from material things, or are they understood in their own light? Or are you grasping the form of the good? So yeah, of course, some of those are better than others, but they're all great. It's sort of like saying, which do you like better, the oysters or the filet mignon? Well, they're both better than oatmeal. Um, and then, a lot of things. Plato sets the bar for what counts as knowledge so high. This is where he and Aristotle are quite different. That most things that we would consider knowledge aren't really knowledge in his book, right? So it's kind of a non-starter until we get to later commentators on the Platonists. All right. Spotbed asked, the video isn't even up yet. Why the hell are there already dislikes? Because there's dicks out there. Right? There's sour people who, like to have a beef about something. I'm always amazed, with some of the videos that I post. It seems like no matter what philosopher you pick, there's somebody who doesn't like what you're doing with it. And I also do a little rant here. There's always people who are like, the core concept videos, well, those would be really great if you just get rid of that long intro. And my answer to them is always like, I'm actually going to shoot one of those Dr. Sadler responds videos. Uh, are you so like entitled and lazy that you can't like skip ahead, 30 seconds, 45 seconds? If that really, really bothers you, you're getting, sort of an expert discussion, might not be the best expert discussion, but an expert discussion of stuff for free. And you're going to complain about it. But, that's the nature of the world that we live in. And it's always been that way. Going back to Plato, right? One of the cool things about Plato, even if he's wrong about most things, he's right about this. Any instance of some sort of ideal that you find in reality is always going to be flawed, and you can always look at it from a different side and find justice to be injustice in some respect. But it doesn't cease to be the good that it is, the relative good that it is, because of that. So all right, let's see what's going down here. Just skipped again. That's one of the features I wish they'd fix on this is that as soon as you start scrolling down, it like jumps all over the place. All right, Aaron says, like to take this opportunity to thank you for your work. I enjoy listening to your lectures. Great. I'm glad that they are helpful for you. You might want to check out the podcast, the Sadler's Lectures, because what I've been doing is taking my core concept videos and turning those into downloadable lectures. Doing that in part because then I can give them to my students to listen to. So I've got to get a lot of those done for the coming classes. But they're nice for other people too, because then if you want to listen to the stuff, you don't have to have YouTube running in the background, right? There was something else I was going to say. Oh yeah, one of the other things I'm going to start doing with the Sadler's lectures, I've done this with a few, is start taking the sound files of my old like public talks and turning those into podcast lectures as well. But those take a while. All right. Gustavo asks, have you read De Quincey's Last Days of Immanuel Kant? I haven't. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've ever read De Quincey. And that sounds kind of interesting. I suppose I should take a look at that. I'm going to be teaching Kant again, as I always do. Seems like I never get away from Kant because I'm doing ethics class this year. Jo asks, any hints on your book projects? Yeah, so this year I am going to be working with a co-editor to take some of the articles from Stoicism Today and put them into an edited volume that hopefully will be out by the next Stoicon. We're going to be doing that for the Modern Stoicism organization, so all the funds from that will go to help fund Modern Stoicism's activities, which include Stoicon, the Stoicon X's, Stoic Week, all this cool stuff. I'm working on a book. I've got a lot of different book projects going on, and one of the ones I'm going to be working on this year is on Stoicism and anger, understanding and managing anger, using the Stoics. And I may be working on that with a collaborator, or I may be working on that alone. Things are a little bit up in the air about that. I do have a lot of other book projects that I want to get back working on, but that's a matter of like scheduling the time and jealously guarding it, not letting other things get in there. And that's just been tough to do this last year. I mean, I taught 15 academic classes, including through the summer, and teaching classes for me is not what it is for some people who just kind of phone it in. I build entire class shells for that. I don't know how many people I did tutorial or philosophical counseling or consulting sessions with. And, I gave probably at least 20 public talks over the last year as well. So I've got to find ways to make sure I get the writing done when I need to get it done. I'll also mention too, I said I was going to get to some academic writing. So I'm doing some academic writing on my own, taking stuff that was conference papers or things I wrote and submitted before, even a few orphaned pieces. I've got to like work those back up into what I consider good enough shape and then send them out. But I'm also doing some co-writing as well, and this is something that I particularly like doing as an academic. We don't do this enough in philosophy, and I think we should encourage more and more of that. So I'll be doing some more co-written papers this year as well. Doesn't mean they'll get published this year, of course, because the academic publication sometimes takes a very long time to get through. All right. Floyd asks, would I ever make a video series on Emmanuel Levinas? Yeah, as a matter of fact, he's somebody I've been meaning to get to, in part because in the ethics classes that I teach, one of the sort of broad topics is egoism versus altruism, right? And so egoism, you look at, say, Plato and Glaucon and the Ring of Gyges and the discussion of it in book 2, or we talk about it in Ayn Rand. I'm going to be doing some stuff on Max Stirner fairly soon as well. And then for the altruism stuff, I like Albert Schweitzer. And I'll do some videos, hopefully, on him, some core concept stuff, and also some stuff on Levinas, because Levinas does articulate a certain kind of altruism, albeit in terms of an absolute duty that is flowing ultimately from God and is revealed in the face of the other. So I'll be doing some stuff on Levinas. I'm not really sure which ones I'll be doing. Comrade Gabe, what are my first and foremost broad thoughts on Deleuze? I've said this many times. I like Deleuze. I don't like the stuff he does with Guattari quite as much, like Anti-Oedipus. I really like The Logic of Sense. I really like Essays, Critical and Clinical. So, and I like the history of philosophy stuff that he does, but you should always remember that when you're reading Deleuze, as with many other people doing history of philosophy, you're getting more Deleuze than the actual person that he's writing about. So I don't like Deleuzians that much, but I don't really like Ians all that much when it comes to most of the contemporary continental stuff. Like, I don't like Levinasians, because all the Levinasians that I know, they just blather on and on and on about how doing theory is hypocrisy and the face of the other and blah 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 blah. And after a while, that gets kind of tiresome, because really it stands in the way of doing anything productive with the philosophy. And if we have to condemn the history of philosophy prior to us as being just a whole bunch of abortive mistakes, which Levinas himself is not doing, but Levinasians often do, then it's not worth reading, for as far as I'm concerned. Nominus, who in philosophy do you have the most fun reading? Well, that's a great question. I think I've said this before. Lev Shestov is really, really fun. Totally anti-systematic, but really incisive, understands the movements in philosophy of his time, always willing to like get in that little barb here and there. And I think his earlier works are more enjoyable than later works like Athens and Jerusalem are. Probably that's his most read book. But yeah, let's see. Hangover Haze, what are your thoughts regarding the Stoic notion towards suicide? So the Stoics thought that suicide was justified, but that most people who commit suicide do so for the wrong reasons, and therefore it's unjustified. Um, it's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? Right? It's it's fine for the sage to do it, or the person who's doing so rationally, but it's not fine for somebody just to do it out of despair. So if you think about famous Stoic suicides, Cato commits suicide for a greater purpose. Seneca does so as well at the order of Nero, because if he hadn't, his family would have suffered. Um, they weren't saying, well, just do it whenever you want to. All right. Mongoose MC Queen. Love. Hi, Dr. Sadler. Love your work. Thanks for that. Do you have any advice for young people living in an increasingly nihilistic, atheistic, materialistic world? Hard to find meaning. Yeah, so I do. And part of it is you are not alone. Um, and this is not a world that is more nihilistic at this point in time than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago. Nietzsche was already, trumpeting the advent of an entire century of nihilism back in the late 19th century. It's just a question of how it manifests itself to us. And it's very easy to feel as if our times are way shittier than anybody else's. Now, speaking from sort of a materialist basis and just looking at things in terms of buying power, debt, capacity to move, socially and stuff like that. For younger people, and by that I would mean millennials and Generation Z, kids, my kids' age, college students as well. Things are objectively worse. It's tougher to find jobs. There's more competition. You have less buying power. You have less capacity to accumulate equity, healthcare, education. All these things cost more, way, way more than they should. And things have been screwed up for such a long time in so many different ways that it often seems like it's impossible to change the system and the trajectory that we're on. That said, the boomers are going to die, and Generation X, my generation, is still around, and many of them seem quite motivated to work on things and to try to come up with solutions that the boomers have for a long time stood in the way of, whether just through inertia or selfishness or their own misguided stuff. Who shares the most fake news? The boomers. And we could go on and on and on with that. And things are not. The other thing to keep in mind is we don't just have the United States. We're within a world system, parts of which are really horrific, parts of which are better. I mean, we might actually someday take the lead of the other civilized first world countries, and by that I don't mean that other countries aren't civilized. I'm just saying there's a certain level of civilization where you start to say one measure would be, do we provide adequate health care for our citizens? And in the United States, the answer is no. And in most of the other places, the answer is yes. And it won't be great, but it'll at least be, a modicum of care. Some places are moving away from that, like Britain, because of the Tories, seems to be moving away from that. So, if you consider things in that light, yeah, things are pretty shitty. But we also live in a time when, if you want to, watch videos discussing Immanuel Kant and you want to learn about Kant, not only can you get Kant's text online, you can watch all sorts of people discussing it. and you can communicate with other people about it, and that allows not just learning in terms of education, but also learning from the situations of other people as well. So I would, this is going to sound Pollyannish, but I would try to focus on the positive as much as you can. One of the good things about, say, Stoicism, or also a properly understood Aristotelianism or existentialism, is it does say, okay, the system itself does matter, but it's not the totality. The individual does count for something, and you can work on this part, right? And you're probably not going to ever like make it perfect. I'm certainly not close to perfect in many things. I do work on anger because I still lose my temper, but you can work on yourself, and you can work on that penumbra of relationships around you, and you can decide which way you want your life to go. And sometimes it's tough. I'm seeing my own kids struggle with these sorts of things, and you want to like solve the problems for them, but of course you can't. Um, but it is possible to change who you are, and then how the world weighs upon you. So, all right. Bullet and Ascent. Why is the video quality so bad? I don't know. I'm not a tech person. I wouldn't complain about it. I'd look on the bright side that you actually get to be in on the stream. I mean, if that's what you want to ask about, okay. Julian Carlson, how can one reorient oneself and pursue new relationships after a painful long-term relationship? That's a good one. That came up. Somebody was writing about that, and I thought I would do some writing about that myself in the new year, because that's a common issue. So, oh, I know, it was in a help a reporter out query. Somebody's doing an article on it. So, part of what you have to do when you're coming out of a long-term relationship is constantly remind yourself that you have become accustomed to something that is no longer the case and is not going to be the case. So your instincts, your responses, your feelings, your thought patterns, they're all gonna be kind of off. And sometimes they're still good, and sometimes you may have great realizations, but you probably want to keep that in mind and avoid making any big new commitments. Rebound relationships are usually a bit of a mistake. I've been in some myself. None of them actually uh, made it through, and it's good sometimes just to take some time apart and figure out what's going on with yourself. You're getting used to like being no longer in a kind of connection, sort of like taking off a uniform that you've worn a long time, or a carapace. Like, let's say you were an insect, you're molting, or an arachnid, right? It's all going to feel weird to you. So before you pursue new relationships, you do want to reorient yourself. That's a great way to put it. And reorienting yourself, I personally think that the big things that you want to try to do to reorient yourself, think about what your life goals are. What you intend in terms of your education or career. Um, think about your own physical health, and whether you're working out enough, whether you're getting the exercise that you need, whether you're eating well, whether you're taking care of yourself. Easy to let slide when you're feeling depressed. um, think about what you want to study, what you want to get out of things, how you want to change yourself over time. Maybe learn a new language or something like that, right? And I would also I would think about the nature of your relationships. It might be worth, if you've had a lot of them, doing kind of a retrospective and thinking, oh man, have I been doing like the same pattern? Have I been dating the same person over and over again? Maybe I need to change that. So, all right. Our brain hurts a lot. Uh, Thanks for that. Professor, do you know any secular, non-spiritual books or ways to prepare for death? I'm young and healthy, just want to be ready. Yeah, I mean that's where philosophical traditions, I think, can be quite helpful. The Stoics, that's one of the things that they do. They call it the premeditatio malorum, the thinking ahead about bad things that could happen, and one of those are about death. You think about, well, if I die, what's going to be the outcome of that? What am I leaving behind? Do I have the resources to die well, or am I going to die crying about it or things like that? I think the existentialists have a lot of great contributions to make. Somebody who you wouldn't think about in that light, because when we say existentialists, people think like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. Okay, there's them, and then we got Heidegger, Being Towards Death, and Jean-Paul Sartre and all that. But I would actually suggest taking a look at Rainer Maria Rilke. I would look at his Letters to a Young Poet, and I would look at his I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, Duino Elegies, which are talking quite a bit about death. And I would read around in his other letters too. He wrote quite a lot about that. Also, some good discussion of it in the Notebooks of Malta Lawrence Brigge, his one main novel that he wrote. Um, there's other good discussions about the meaning of one's death in somebody like Camus, and I don't mean just the myth of Sisyphus, um, the Rebel, Letters to a German Friend. Those discuss that as well. Um, his books, his novels. I mean, not and The Stranger is okay, but it's a very early novel, and it's kind of flat in many respects compared to The Plague or The Fall. I would take a look at some of those. And then, there's a lot of really great discussions about the meaning of death within the scope of a character's life and thoughts by speculative fiction writers. Philip K. Dick is pretty good in that respect. Um, Somebody who I read a lot of recently that I really enjoyed was R. Scott Bacher, but I don't know that he would be that helpful, though he might. Um, Ursula K. Le Guin, really great philosophical science fiction and fantasy writer. So there's those sort of things that you can look at as well. Um, and another thing I would suggest, if it exists nearby, there are these things that are called death cafes, and they're fairly unstructured. People get together and they just talk about death in an unstructured way for usually like an hour together over coffee. And I mean, the mere fact that you can actually like go there and talk with people, that's a big thing, because most of the time people want to avoid talking about death. So I think that might be helpful for you. All right, Jo, favorite Lovecraft work? That's tough. Um, there are so many really good short stories in his stuff, and he's a great storyteller too. I know some people don't like him because they think his stuff is too drawn out, and he has too many adjectives in there. But I don't know. That's I have to take a pass on that. R.T. Whitby, since you're a scholar of Aristotle and St. Anselm, what are the most common misconceptions about Aristotle and Anselm of Canterbury? Anselm of Canterbury is easy. That all he really did was the ontological argument, and you don't need to read any further than chapter 2, perhaps to 4 in Proslogion, or that he had a feudal conception of the atonement, and that we've gone way past that in Cur Deus Homo. I mean, that's an easy one right there. Aristotle, the biggest misconception is that Aristotle was an Aristotelian. Aristotelians are usually not as interesting as Aristotle himself, who's got a much more fluid approach to things most of the time. He doesn't argue in syllogisms the way that people would like to make him do. So that's probably good for that. Wendy's got a question that I'm not competent to answer. Which Middle Eastern philosopher do I think was the best? I don't read Arabic or Persian or any of that those languages, so I can't read things in the original. And I haven't read, widely in Islamic philosophy, so I'm not really a good person to say anything about that. Gin Stampede. Since I posted a video about my work in YouTube, what do I think about channels such as Philosophy Tube or ContraPoints? I feel like philosophy on YouTube is getting too cinematic. Well, I don't hold them in high regard. I think they're doing something very different than what I'm doing, which is to provide, sort of a even, balanced, competent exposition of the ideas that I'm discussing. I think they are going for being much more cinematic. And I was, for example, I don't remember which, I think it was Philosophy Tube, very deeply disappointed to see that, you know, he was essentially reducing Hegel to the master slave dialectic. You look at Hegel's phenomenology, the master slave dialectic is this tiny little sliver in it. And then there's all this other stuff in there dealing with that stuff, but in much more complicated ways, because the dialectic of recognition on Erkennen, which is running throughout the entire work and motivating the entire work, is getting worked out in much more complex and developed ways. So I think there's a tendency to like go for the very, very low hanging fruit and to try to get as many views as possible and to make a buck and get some notoriety. But I guess you got to ask what's going to be around, assuming that video stuff is still around, a couple hundred years from now. What's going to have made any sort of lasting impact? Glitzy stuff, high production stuff that essentially regurgitates the same ideas as all the other things out there, or things that are going deeper into it. And again, I'm not claiming that I'm going too deep into it. I'm still doing things at a fairly surface level, but that's because there's so much that needs to be done. All right, Nominus, is it a good or bad idea to read philosophical chronologically? Neither. I mean, you can read philosophy in any way you want. I'll say the same thing that I say every time. Whatever order you're going to do it in, you're going to deviate from that order because you're going to go back and reread stuff, and it'll be like sometimes reading it for a first time, after you've read some stuff later on, or you've read some things that connect with it, or you just developed a better grasp of how to read philosophical texts. So you don't have to read things chronologically. I certainly didn't when I was starting out, but then again, I didn't have any guidance whatsoever from my professors. Um, John Stifter has a very interesting suggestion here. I think the philosophy of personhood and memory will be front and center in the next decade due to genetic editing and AI. Yeah, I think that that's probably right. And I don't know that it'll be, well, genetic editing, I guess, will be part of that. But, um, what we call neuroscience is sort of just a grab bag of stuff that's brilliant all the way to stuff that's wrong and bullshit and everything in between. But that's become a fixture of our scientific mentality, and that's going to be playing an important role. And so that ties in with the conception of personhood and agency and all these other things that we think about in terms of persons. AI is definitely going to play a role. Other things that are going to come up with it will be, issues of the robots and AIs that we use. Everything from autonomous vehicles, and there I'm not thinking so much about cars, but like trucks and other major transportation things for all the goods that we have, all the way to sex robots, to maybe there'll be something like back in the day there was Eliza, which was a it wasn't really an AI program, and it wasn't really a therapist, but it was purporting to be something like that. It was an early basic program that you could write. I learned it when I was like 10, and there'll be something, like that eventually, where you'll go and talk to. William Gibson actually, I think, has it in one of his books, but Dick also has it in some of his. But Gibson, I think he actually uses the word Eliza. Um, Eventually, that'll be part of it too. And is that a person that you're corresponding with or not? All of those are going to come up as well. Spabed has a meta question. Dr. Sadler, on these Hangouts, do you prefer rather general questions or questions directly related to philosophy or philosophers? Either's fine. You know, um, sure. If you mean determinism in terms of like a commitment to there being like a hard determinism, everything being determined, it's not just a tension, there's a contradiction with Sartrean existentialism. And Sartre discusses this very extensively in Being and Nothingness. So you would want to, dig around in there. It comes up a lot in terms of his conception of how we human beings, we emerge. It is very similar to what other thinkers like Blondel say as well. We emerge from a determinism and act and contribute something new, and then we come back into a determinism because we have a coherent world that we're within. And then other people do that too. Mandrat Warrior says, Happy New Year, Professor. Well, Happy New Year to you as well, and to all of you. Jean Leroy, I've found that I can only think about philosophical ideas when I'm walking. This may sound silly, but I was wondering if it also happens to you. That doesn't happen to me. I do have ideas that come to me while I'm walking from place to place, or while I'm working out, or while I'm doing other things that are kind of repetitive motions that allow my mind to wander. Maybe that's what's going on with you. Maybe you need something that allows your mind to wander, and for you, walking is what does it. It's the exclusivity part of it that, for me, would be a little worrying. If you can only do it while you're walking, then how are you going to do it when you're laying down, or riding the bus, or sitting with a bunch of friends over coffee or drinks or something like that? But I suppose maybe it has to do with being able to relax. I don't know. I don't know your situation enough to say, but Aristotle, the reason why it was called the peripatetic school is because he liked to walk around. Peripatane. Yeah, I think, right. I may be mixing my Greek up, and so he would lecture as he was walking, and I kind of like to do that myself when I have the space. So, but just being able to think about stuff like that when you're walking, that could be a real problem. Kian Sarah, would I ever consider doing a video on Camus' The Fall? Yeah, sure. Maybe multiple videos. If I ever do get the existentialist philosophy and literature series where I was doing like hour-long videos started again, which is a factor of time and stuff like that, then The Fall would be a great one to do. And so would, I just said it, The Plague. Right? Abdul asked, what is my favorite Camus novel? And it is The Plague. All right. Sarah Wall, do I know Ken Wilber? Do I like that point of view? Ken Wilber doesn't ring a bell. Let's see, American writer on transpersonal psychology. Nope, I don't know this guy at all. Looks like he was roughly in my parents' generation, was into a bunch of different things. So I don't know the guy. Trenton Ward, I'm currently reading The Golden Sayings. What advice for a self-directed learner would you share? Something about that text. Also, I was wondering if you'd ever do a video on Confucianism. I may do videos on Confucianism as well as other non-Western traditions of thought, but I'm always leery about doing stuff on works and thinkers and traditions where I can't read the original. It's easy to get things wrong, and I mean, I might end up doing it in part because at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, um, it looks like I'll be teaching a world religions class before too long, and I do want to talk about Confucianism in terms of virtue ethics and connect it with business ethics as well for my business ethics classes that I teach. So I might do some stuff. Now, the golden sayings, you're talking about Epictetus, right? The golden sayings is just another way for the handbook or, whatever you want to call it. People have published the Enchiridion under a number of different titles. So the same thing goes, for the Enchiridion. I did that thing on self-directed study of Stoic philosophy. You might want to check out that video. I did, an entire course on the Enchiridion that's available out there for free, so that might be helpful as well. That just skipped again. Let's see what we got here. Here's a good question from Giorgio. Would the Greeks recognize our democracy as such? Probably not. I don't think so. No. They would see it as an incredibly complex. I mean, the ancient Greeks would it would take them a long time to adjust to our current social system and economic system. Once they wrap their head around it, I think they would, if they were thinking in terms of democracy, they'd be like, wow, your democracies are really oligarchical. You use this word democracy, they'd be like that guy in the Princess Bride. I don't think you know what this word means, right? So, and some democracies are more democratic. In the United States, we got some real problems with that. All right. Shang-Yi Chin, I guess. Is there a boundary of philosophical thinking? There's lots of boundaries, and every time that we set one up, we always find ourselves on the other side of it. Hegel talks about that dynamic in the early parts of the Science of Logic, and I think he's right about that. Windy AC, is there an explanation book of the Critique of Pure Reason? You like a commentary, you mean? Yeah, there's tons of them out there. I don't know whether any of them are any good because I don't read a lot of secondary literature. If I want to read a text, I just read that text. I don't spend a lot of time with that sort of thing. Nick Climbs Hills. Why do you think Malebranche is so underappreciated in the history of philosophy sequence courses at universities? Well, he's not in French universities because he's one of their boys, right? And they also read Pascal way more often than English speakers do. Pascal also deserves to be read in the history of modern philosophy, just as much as Spinoza does or Leibniz does. I think Anglo-American philosophy has that typical shtick of, well, there's Hobbes, and we don't really know what to do with him. And then we've got the continental rationalist, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about Arnaud on the way. And then we've got our good old British empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Maybe we'll talk about Reid a bit and the common sense people. Oh, we run out of time. That's sort of the typical way of doing modern philosophy. They also got to shoehorn Rousseau in there somewhere too, right? Maybe Voltaire. Malebranche, he's an interesting guy. I enjoyed reading him. I haven't read him since graduate school, but I enjoyed reading him. The whole occasionalism thing, that's pretty hard to swallow, but no more hard to swallow than Spinoza's account of things, I think, right? So, all right. So here's a funny one. A man Resu 56. I searched for Sadler podcast on Google and got the Naked with Cat Sadler podcast. Probably want to put in Gregory Sadler podcast, right? Yeah, Kat Sadler. What is her deal? I can't remember. She came up in some searches. Was she like an actress or a cook or something like that? She must be trying to make some money on something. Um, all right, Nabarius asks, which branch of moral philosophy, realism, objectivism, nihilism do you subscribe to and why? I don't know. I don't subscribe to any isms because they're always abstract, construals of things that mean a million different things depending on who's saying it. You know, objectivism could mean anything you like. So that I don't find those very helpful. Factotum. What's your opinion on Paul Feyerabend and his epistemological anarchism? I don't have any opinion on him. I don't really know what his position is. I can tell you this, that everybody that I've known who's really big on Feyerabend has always been a jerk, so that doesn't make me want to read him. All right. Bullet Incent. What do I think separates bad philosophy from good philosophy? Not a simple question or a simple answer to that one. I would say that probably a big portion of it is whether you actually know what you're talking about. So if you're going to complain about, how Kant did this or that, you got to know your Kant, right? And if you're going to, I'd also say that a lot of bad philosophy is reinventing wheels because people don't know the history of philosophy, and doing so in ways that are less interesting than the people who did it before. R.T. Whitby, if you could talk to your younger self when you started teaching, what tips would you give your younger self? Wow, that's a good one. Don't be such a hothead. When students screw up, it's not because they're being lazy most of the time or unwilling to do things. It's often just because things didn't align properly. So Maxwell Thompson Kurtz, how would you explain the phenomenon of hallucinations in schizophrenic people? I don't. That's not my area, so I don't worry about that. Rebecca, I always enjoy your talks on Stoicism and the Stoics. I look forward to finding your podcast. Happy New Year, Professor. Oh, thanks. That's very nice. I'm glad that you like that. Floyd Mayweather Sr., have you ever read Peter Rollins and his work in pyrotheology? No, I'm following him on Patreon, but I've never actually read his stuff. Just because I wanted to see what he's doing with his account, because he seems to be pretty successful in getting people to shell out money for whatever he's doing. But I don't have a clue what pyrotheology is supposed to be. I'm pretty distrustful of anybody who comes up with a new, sexy named system or approach at this point. All right, I'm going to have to scroll down a bit because I'm going to have to, I could hang out for a bit longer. I don't have anything. I have some work I'm going to do today, but I suppose I can go longer than the hour I originally scheduled. So R.T. Whitby, what was the relationship between Rene Descartes and the Rosicrucians? None as far as I know, but I'm not into esoteric stuff, so I don't pay any attention to that kind of stuff. Comrade Gabe, what are your thoughts on both more orthodox Marxist and post-structural Marxist conceptions of history? For example, historical materialism and also Foucault's concepts of history. So I think Foucault is an interesting guy. There's a lot of good work out there that adapts Foucault, not so much in philosophy, more in like sociology and history and other things like that. I think that Marx had his finger on a number of points where he was right, and it's great that Marx is part of a classical tradition. If you read Marx and you actually pay attention and you don't approach it in a polemical, sort of like, oh, this is a bad guy, or this is the savior kind of bullshit stuff, but you actually like just see what's going on there. There's a lot of stuff in Marx that's very Aristotelian, That's why, within like the Alistair McIntyre oriented spectrum, there's Aristotelian Thomists and hardcore Marxists, and they come together and talk about things. There's radical Aristotelianism. So I think that Marxism itself is there's a constant attention to which needs to be there, whether it's Marxism or whether it's other things like say Catholic social theory. There always has to be attention to how are the people who are vulnerable being affected by things, and who actually has power, and how do we move towards the good that we would share together, and is history moving towards more and more oligarchical and very stratified positions, or can we move it towards something that's more egalitarian? Those are all key questions that the Marxist tradition helps to keep alive when it's doing its job. There's plenty of, as we used to call them, Neiman Marxists out there, rich kids who, read some Marx and now they're going to, fix the world or some nonsense like that, but they're actually not going to open up their pocketbooks, let alone get into, real work to do that. I'm not a Marxist myself, but I think there's a lot should be recommended in reading Marx and Marx's successors. Potting soil, full seminar on boomers, please. That might infuriate me. um, it's funny actually. So my kid Maddie remarked to my dad, who's obviously a boomer, right? My biological dad. He said, "You're one of the good ones. The boomers really messed a lot of things up." This is a 12-year-old, right? A member of Generation Z said, "You're one of the good boomers. All the rest of them are bad." Now, that's typical kids, right? They have a fairly simplistic understanding of the world. All right. Let's see here. Some people arguing back and forth about Marxism. There's Mark Trumbull, longtime correspondent, guy who I've met up with, him and his wife at Stoicon, and then here at the Aristotelian conference. Somebody I'd call a long-standing friend. Happy New Year. May you have health and insight in the following year. Thanks, Mark. That's really good. And I hope the same for you and your wife, and I hope our paths cross again, whether down here in the Milwaukee area or if I ever get up near Toronto again, we'll definitely have to get together and hang out and hopefully have a meal together this time. Wouldn't that be nice? All four of us. So, all right, Jacob Donato, the stories we're telling ourselves are lies, covering up what we're doing. The truth is what we're doing in social interaction, not the inner stories. Dr. Zizek, this is an example of meta-philo. I guess there's no follow-up to that. Okay. Stephen Warren, Happy New Year's Eve. Happy New Year's to you. Do you have any thoughts on Heidegger's being towards death? Yeah, I think it's a good insight. I I know that myself, since I've been a kid, and I know other people like this as well, including a long-standing correspondent of mine named Bruce, from childhood, we had that affectivity where we knew that we could die. I people say, "Oh, children, they believe they're invincible." I never thought that. And I think there's others like that as well. And I don't know that we can generalize it to say that it's an absolute condition of all Dasein, all human existence. Maybe there are some people who just never do encounter that, but they're missing something by not doing so. And I think Heidegger is also right that most people do try to cover this up in some way or another, not consciously, but there's a reaction against it, the contingency of our existence. I don't think that's unique to him. I mean, I think Nietzsche was onto the same thing, and I think Kierkegaard talks about something quite similar. So I think there's something there. Christo says he's interested in reading Kierkegaard. Which of his works would I suggest you start off with? That's a good question. Usually I start people on that short selection, The Crowd is Untruth, and The Present Age, which are pretty good for introducing people to Kierkegaard. I often teach Fear and Trembling. Um, Philosophical Fragments could actually be a good place to start as well. Um, or Sickness onto Death. That's nice and short. It's dense, but it's pretty good. So, I mean, again, with philosophers, expect to read and reread and reread. So, you know, um, it doesn't. You don't have to actually start necessarily. Fled from nowhere. Do you have any advice besides getting professional help for someone struggling with suicidal thoughts? Um, I mean, what I have to say may not be particularly helpful. I'll say this: you're definitely not alone, and there's a lot of people who are struggling in that way. I certainly have struggled in my lifetime at different points, um, and so I don't know if that helps to know that. Sometimes hearing that other people have struggled with it is helpful. Sometimes it's not. Another thing to realize is that however shitty you feel, and if you do have suicidal thoughts, it's usually because you're feeling pretty bad. It is possible to not feel as bad, and to do that without resorting to chemicals, but to do so by working on yourself. It won't happen immediately. There's no like magic bullet that you can snap your fingers and suddenly you feel better, but um, there are things out there that can help. And so if you have what William James called faith in others' faith, right? Belief in others' belief, you don't necessarily have to believe it right now, um, but you can trust that other people are right in saying that there are things that could help you over time. And I'm sorry that you're if it's you that's struggling with it, I'm sorry that you're struggling with it. Um, this is a particularly hard time too, right? The holidays. So that's something important to keep in mind as well. Sometimes things look worse in these weird days at the end of the year and the darkest time of the year as well. So um, I don't know if that helps at all, but at least I took a stab at it, I guess. Anthony Fickery, how would I compare Pascal's religious thought with that of Kierkegaard? They've got a lot of things in common. Both of them often get tarred as being anti-rationalist, but they're really saying no, rationality, if it's going to be truly rational, has to be able to engage with what goes beyond it, what its other is. And they're both, drawing on the history of Christian thought and religious experience. So, one from a Lutheran perspective, one from a Catholic perspective, although Pascal's, effectively a Jansenist. So, um, kind of a Protestant perspective there as well. 3x4 architecture. What's the best question I've been asked on a live chat? I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, I don't know how many hours of live chat I've done. So Nicholas asked one I can't really answer. What philosophical papers or works are most influential this decade? I don't know. I don't keep my finger on that pulse, so I can't really say. Here's a good one. Kumathros, what's your take on thought experiments? I think they can be quite helpful. I think that making a career out of playing around with like trolley problems is not it's not much of a philosophical career, but I think thought experiments can be quite good for driving things home. I mean, we often see that being done in fiction, don't we? One of the oldest thought experiments is the Plato's Ring of Gyges, and I use that almost every semester with some class, right? So they can be quite good. David Ireland, studying for LSAT, and its wife on my lectures. Any advice for LSAT students studying logic? Well, I don't know. I don't know that much about the LSAT. I would say do as many logic puzzles as you can. The way you get good at doing logic is by doing it. Doing exercise after exercise after exercise. Philosophy and science. What are your thoughts on Robert Wallace's book, Hegel's Philosophy of Reality, Freedom, and God? Haven't read it, so I don't know. Zeno asked, have I read Phenomenology of Perception? If so, can I offer any advice on how to read it? Yeah, as a matter of fact, I took an entire course on the Phenomenology of Perception when I was in grad school, and I like Merleau-Ponty quite a bit. It's useful to know a bit about Husserl and maybe even Shaler a bit when you're heading into it, but it's kind of funny. So part of the backstory of that book is before Husserl's stuff was actually translated into French, people assumed that Merleau-Ponty and what he was putting forward in the Phenomenology of Perception was like very close to Husserl. As it turned out, no, he's doing his own thing that's influenced quite a bit by Husserl, but he's really doing his own thing. And so, he veers off in a lot of different directions. But one of the things, here's something to keep in mind that'll really help out. And he says this early on in the book. All the different fields that he's studying, like language or sexuality or motor things, they all come together in normal perception. It's when people are damaged in some way that these things start getting split off from each other and not functioning well with each other. So that might be helpful. Jakob Rush, what's my viewpoint on the Epicurean response to death? I always found it to be a rational sublime towards death anxiety. So what is the Epicurean response to death? It's this kind of interesting little argument that says you don't have to worry about death. Why not? Because you're not going to be there when you're dead. There's nothing that you're going to suffer from. And that's not bad. It's certainly better than Socrates' argument made in the Apology, where he says it's going to be like a really great sleep. Don't you remember the most wonderful sleep that you had? It'll be like that. And then he said, well, yeah, but you got to be conscious in order to actually enjoy that sleep. So Epicurus is saying there's no consciousness after death. Interestingly, Epicurus left a will, and I did a podcast episode with the Death Hangout guys, specifically on philosophers' wills, and we talked about Epicurus. And well, why would a materialist leave a will? Why should he care about what happens afterwards? So it's kind of an interesting issue. Fled from Nowhere, Death Cafe could be an anime show. Well, I think they got the trademark on it, the Death Cafe people. So I don't know. Oh, yeah, there's a great suggestion here from William Thomas Sherman. The question about death before. Try Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich. Although, that one's kind of depressing, isn't it? So, all right. Oh, Mark says Shirley Ann's telling me to tell you Happy New Year to you and Andy. Well, Happy New Year to you and Shirley Ann from both of us. And I hope someday we're able to meet up again. That'll be very nice. Raymond, thoughts on philosophy of Ridley Scott? I don't know that. Does Ridley Scott have a philosophy? He's certainly got an aesthetic, but I don't know if he's got a philosophy. Bruno asks, what are some of the benefits you attain from studying philosophy that you might enjoy as well? Well, I like the fact that I have a number of different concepts that have helped me to live my life in a better way and to slowly, progressively unscrew it up. Not finished yet, and things keep getting screwed up, but philosophy at least the philosophy that I've been studying and the ways in which I've been studying it have been very helpful for that. So I think that could be quite good. Steve asks, I've taken a few philosophy classes, but I haven't noticed many people talking about the pragmatists. Is there a reason for this? Is pragmatism not very popular? Well, that's because analytic philosophy, when it came into the United States, it effectively colonized it. And it really ended up repressing a number of other ways of doing philosophy, which included classical American philosophy, which included the pragmatic tradition, and included what we nowadays call continental philosophy, which was being done it made its way largely through Catholic universities, in part because Catholics were in touch with what was going on in Europe at the time. It repressed other modes of doing philosophy, often deliberately so. I mean, I saw this where I went to graduate school, Southern Illinois University. There was a period where the analytics who were dominating the department tried to phase out all the continental and American philosophy people. So that's part of the reason why. And then most people in academic philosophy are rather conservative in this respect. They may be politically liberal, but they're conservative in that they think that what they studied is what's important. So if they didn't get a very broad spectrum of research, they're mostly exposed to analytic philosophy. They don't do the work of like looking outside of that and the work that's required to like appreciate other traditions. Well, then they think analytic philosophy is the only game in town, or that continental and analytic philosophy are the only games in town, and they forget about all these other ways of doing philosophy, including good history of philosophy. So yeah, that's part of it. Pablo says, I wanted to thank you for your work on YouTube. Half Hour Hegel is just amazing. Thanks very much. I'm hoping I can get it back going this coming year. I was going to try to shoot a video tonight, but I probably am not going to. Let's see here. X Bluebells, how long before AI gets legal personhood status? Well, that is a really interesting question. I think it'll happen piecemeal. And of course, it'll happen in like one country before it happens in another country. I don't know. And I think one of the more interesting questions to ask is what kind of AI, what function of AI will get personhood status? Will it be a robot that moves around and does things? Will it be, an autonomous car? Will it be some sort of AI that does a fairly routine task that replaces a human being? That's a good question, right? Anirudh says, "I'd like to take this opportunity to thank and appreciate the work you do on YouTube." Thank you very much. That's quite nice. Alexander, did Nietzsche really think that philosophers were diseased or unwell people? He thought that they were and they weren't. I mean, he thinks also that the category of the priest in the genealogy of morals is effectively diseased, but brings about something new as a result. So it's not simply a reductionist sort of view. But Nietzsche really does think that human beings, as we're doing our thinking, and philosophy is a mode of thinking, we are motivated by the stuff that we're, fundamentally interested in, so yeah. All right, just skipped a bit. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, there's a lot of I think there's quite a few questions that I won't get to, even if I try. All right. Reinhard Moyer, who would you say are the greatest Christian philosophers? Well, definitely Kierkegaard. right? I mean, Thomas Aquinas is certainly quite good. Um, and I'm a big fan of Anselm. Um, I don't know. It depends on what we want them for, doesn't it? I mean, Pascal too. You should never skip Pascal. Um, Interestingly, Paul Griffiths, when I was interviewing for a position at University of Illinois at Chicago, he was one of the people who was interviewing me, and he took me to his Introduction to Catholicism class. And they only had three books: Augustine's Confessions, parts of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, and Pascal's Pensées. Really nice representation there, right? So that's kind of good. Ex Bluebells, have I ever thought about writing a book that weaved together a moral philosophy that could serve us well in our current times? I'm stuck in Stoicism, but don't know how to mix the other stuff in. Well, with that last part, I would take a look at Alistair McIntyre and what he has to say. And I would also take a look at Long's article. If you just type in, A. Long, Stoicism, McIntyre, the article will come up. I forget the exact name of it, but he talks about how Stoicism can be this living tradition. But have I ever thought about writing a book that weaved together a moral philosophy? Yes, I have. I don't know whether I can actually do it. It's one thing to daydream about writing a book. It's another to actually pull it off. I don't know that I could actually do anything that would be better than what other people are doing out there. So I'm certainly going to do things that are pieces of that. As a matter of fact, I'll put this idea out there. I've thought about writing something that would be sort of like Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, sort of like letters to a young philosopher about how you might start studying philosophy and what things to avoid and what things to definitely get into, but that's not so much about moral philosophy. That's more like how do you study philosophy. So. All right, Alexander, I find myself being less enthused with modern philosophy these days and more interested in Christianity. Thoughts? Well, there's a lot of overlap between them, right? I mean, Descartes is a Christian philosopher, according to himself. He calls the Meditations Christian philosophy and the Dedication to the Sorbonne. And there's others who are actually probably more real Christians, like Pascal, and Kierkegaard, and people like that we mentioned already. You're gonna. I think over the course of your studies, you're gonna find you're more interested in some things, and at one point in time, and then you get less interested in it. Something else comes in there. I mean, I thought at one time I just wanted to only do philosophy of language, and then I got led into other things by actually learning Greek, for example. So that's okay. You just don't like abandon the stuff that you had. Think of it as you're acquiring more and more interesting things. Floyd has a clarification here. I wouldn't mind the label pyrotheology too much. He's influenced by Hegel, Lacan, like Zizek, and ultimately looks to help others to recognize the big other in anything, and including Christianity. Okay, that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll give it a look, depending on how much time I have one of these days. I mean, I kind of would just rather read the straight Lacan myself. So, yeah. Polygraphovich, that's what his name. What do you think about personality development trainings and reading motivating literature? What do you think about Dale Carnegie-like books? I think those are at a low level, they're quite useful, but then you need something that's actually more robust. Donald Robertson actually had a great observation that he made one time. So Donald Robertson, major figure in the modern Stoic movement, right? Also a CBT practitioner. And he said, CBT works for some people for some things. It's a great modality of therapy. It's got a lot in connection with ancient Stoic philosophy, but nobody ever reads Burns's Feeling Good more than once if they have to. It's not like Marcus Aurelius where people go back and reread the Meditations over and over and over again. So what's going on there? Well, there's something more, something substantive that's not there in the CBT as a way of doing things. And I think you can say the same thing about Dale Carnegie. I remember reading when I was a kid how to make friends and influence people and being like, oh, okay, I see what this guy's up to. I don't know why people pay him for this shit because half of this stuff you can kind of figure out on your own. And I guess they just need somebody to tell them this sort of thing. So, I think they're not bad in themselves, but I think that you want something more than that. Hangover haze. Why are there so many different interpretations of the word dialectic? For instance, the differences between Plato's Kant's and Hegel's usage, because they're different philosophers and doing different things with it. And the dialectic, like with Hegel, it's something historical. With Plato, it's a way of understanding reality itself. With Kant, it's something bad to engage in. It leads you away from the truth. Um, you know, most philosophical terms are multi meaninged, right? They're what we call polysemic or equivocal. So, Mr. Meow, what's my IQ? So the last time my IQ was measured, I think I was in like maybe seventh grade or so, and it was like 139. So not anywhere near genius level. I'll say this: my IQ is high enough, whatever it happens to be, that I think that IQ is mostly bullshit, and that anybody who places stock in it as a measure of anything is really kind of silly, right? I mean, we know that it's not a great predictor of how well people are going to do with things, and it changes over time. And you can have the same person test several times and get very different answers. So, all right, we got about 3 more minutes before I got to go and start doing some stuff. Let's see what we got that I can grab onto quick. Jeff Burrows, is that a Black Sabbath T-shirt? It certainly is. I got another one of my acquisitions. I've got about 10 different band T-shirts that I wear oftentimes to work out. Let's see here. Blackwood, any advice for a recent college dropout? Yeah, realize that dropping out of college doesn't have to define you, even if other people want it to. And that there's many different ways to be healthy and have good relationships and develop a career that you'll actually find meaning in and enjoy to be successful, right? There's a lot of different ways to do that. Many people have dropped out of college. One of my good close friends did so when he was 19, and he has a computer company that he's run for many years. He's a job creator. He's got like 15 people working for him, and now he doesn't even manage that company. And now he does work with artificial intelligence and various types of trading, and he's very interested in that sort of thing. And he dropped out of college. I'm pretty sure if I had gone into college, having not been in the army, I probably would have dropped out myself. So, I don't allow it to define you. You could say. Let's see what else we got here. A lot of back and forth about Jordan Peterson. People are talking about. Mobile Tiger Home. Could I do a video on how Disney ruined the Eastern philosophy in Star Wars and replaced it with essentially voodoo without consequences? Well, I'm going to probably tick some people off here. First of all, I don't really do pop culture stuff because there's plenty of other people doing that sort of thing. I've always thought the Star Wars Jedi thing was super hokey. It's so wishy-washy, sort of lowest common denominator. All the things that I've disliked about people claiming what they were doing was Zen or Eastern mysticism when I think they were full of shit, I think applies to the Jedis. So I don't think that Disney could make it worse than it already was. And when I went back and rewatched the original Star Wars trilogy, because I saw the prequels, and I was like, the first one I watched, I was like, oh, this is really terrible, and I was like, well, maybe they'll get better, and they didn't, you know. And then I went back with my kids and watched the original ones. I was like, holy crap, is Luke a whiny kid, And this isn't good writing, you know. I just don't get much out of the Star Wars thing myself, unfortunately. So I'm not somebody to do that for you, I think. All right. Nick says, so you like Maiden? I certainly do. As a matter of fact, Iron Maiden used to be my favorite band. I can't really name a favorite band at this time, but Iron Maiden would definitely be in the top 5, as would Black Sabbath, but not just Ozzy Black Sabbath. Got to remember Dio was with them and really revitalized the band. And then Ian Gillan sang with them, Tony Martin, Glenn Hughes, Seven Stars, a pretty good album. So there's a lot of really great singers that have been with them. Motorhead, of course, Judas Priest, and then who would I include as like my fifth? Probably Kiss, So, all right, I'm going to go out on that. So I stayed over about half an hour longer than I was going to. Hope all of you have a great New Year's. I got a lot of video content to shoot, and so I'll see all of you in the interwebs at one point or another. If you're in this area, that is the greater Milwaukee area, which would include Chicagoland or the Fox cities, or going west to Madison, you might consider coming to one of our face-to-face events that we're going to be having. You can find those on the Reason.io calendar as I get them put in there, or going to my Facebook page. But I hope all of you have a great New Year's, whether you make resolutions or not. Keep in mind, too, if you're feeling blue, that you're not alone in that, and that there's no guarantee that things will get better, but there's ways to try to make them so. So, all right, I'll see all of you somewhere down the line.